You get into that complacency as a business for such a long time, you're not necessarily looking out and looking for new partners. And that's what we found here at SunMaid, is that we needed to open the team's eyes up to, there's a lot of other partners out there, or a lot of folks within the vendor community that would very much like the opportunity to work with a business with the size and scale that SunMaid has.
Welcome to the Inside Forbes Councils podcast. Each episode shares transformative insights and advice from members of Forbes Councils, a group of invitation-only communities for successful executives and entrepreneurs. This is Inside Forbes Councils.
Hi everyone, this is Stephen Ganoza. Today we welcome back Steve Bowen. Steve is the CEO of Maine Pointe, a global supply chain and operations consulting firm. He recently sat down with Harry Overly, CEO of Sun-Maid, best known for the iconic little box of raisins, to discuss everything from complacency in product development to improving internal collaboration, and, of course, how a focus on end-to-end supply chain management drives innovation, product development, and ultimately profitability.
Hello everyone, I'm Steve Bowen. I'm CEO of Maine Pointe. We're today a member of the SGS group on a global basis, and we work in the global supply chain and operations space, helping companies to drive improvements in EBITDA, cash, and growth through and around procurement, logistics, and operations through a methodology that we call total value optimization. So I'm very pleased to be able to join you all today and continue this contribution as being a member of the Forbes Business Council and a regular contributor to Forbes.com, and now having an opportunity to do this Forbes podcast forum in a very important way, where we're going to discuss issues around business in general and also the supply chain in that business, particularly kind of the end-to-end supply chain on a global basis, with our guest today, Harry Overly, who is the CEO of Sun-Maid. I think all of you out there will, or most of you will recognize this very iconic brand of Sun-Maid raisins, the growers in California. And Harry, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
All right, thanks for having me, Steve.
Well, I want to get right down to business here, but before we do, perhaps it'd be helpful for the audience to just hear a little bit of your background and how your career took you to where you are today as CEO of Sun-Maid in California.
Sure, absolutely. My background is really all within the consumer packaged goods arena, spanning both larger and smaller size companies, challenged companies to growth companies. I've worked at organizations such as Kraft Foods, the Wrigley Company before it was acquired by Mars, as well as Treehouse Foods, having been part of the core team that really helped build that from a couple $1 billion to nearly $7 billion over about a 7-year run. Post Treehouse, my time has been spent within one stint within the private equity world, where I was the CEO of North America for the leading olive oil sector in the U.S. So Bertolli olive oil, Carapelli olive oil, and worked globally in that position. And as I completed that assignment, as we do within the private equity world, the opportunity for Sun-Maid came about. And at first was intrigued with the opportunity, but had a lot of questions for our board and in trying to understand what the strategy of the business was going to be. Because in the world of agricultural cooperatives, typically you don't see a lot of investment or transformation in those sectors. And they convinced me to come on board with the commitment that they were going to support a new vision and a new strategy for our company. And I was excited to be able to come here and develop that and employ that.
Well, that's quite the background, Harry, and the aspect of something like olive oil and the brand you were associated there, Bertolli, and now Sun-Maid, are just truly well-recognized brands by so many consumers. I'm just curious, as you arrived at Sun-Maid, this company that I think now is about 100, almost 110 years old, if I got my numbers correct. What are some of the key challenges you found in balancing this great legacy and great brand with what the company needed to do into the future operationally?
Yeah, very good question, and one that I probably think about too often in terms of the challenges that I walked into when I joined the company a couple of years ago. Um, the 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 reality of the situation is you have a fantastic brand and organization. To your point, nearly 110 years old. It is an agricultural co-op, so what that means is, we sell our growers crops, and the easy way to explain is at the end of our crop pool years or harvest years, we return those proceeds back to the grower. So it really does play a significant role within the community here in the Central Valley of California. The challenge that I've come into is the fact that from an industry perspective, the United States raisin industry is shrinking, and in the last 20 years has lost 50% of its global market share. So over 50% over 20 years ago, the U.S. was actually the dominant source of supply for raisins globally. Very similar to what you see in the almond industry today, which is a sister agency here in the valley, or sister commodity here in the valley, where 85% of the world's production is done right here in California. Over the past 20 years, the industry, through a variety of different dynamics in management styles, an easy way to put that, has resulted in not being effective in continuing to grow demand, and over time has lost a significant amount of share globally. And so SunMaid, being the biggest player within the industry and the largest dried fruit brand in the world, did have a role to play in that as well. And that being that the recognition that consumers change, consumers' preferences change. SunMaid is the only consumer branded organization within the raisin industry here in the U.S. And just like anybody else, when you're going to be marketing products and you have a beloved brand, it is still important for that brand to communicate with consumers, to understand how consumers' values and needs are changing and evolving. And that was something that SunMaid, as the industry leader, just had not done over the past arguably 20 years or so. So the easy way of saying is the brand hasn't been nurtured during that time. So, and because it hasn't been nurtured, it didn't have the operating infrastructure to nurture it, the capability to nurture that. And then you dig a bit deeper into understanding what we'll talk about on this complete supply chain side of things. There was tremendous amount of opportunity to really reposition the business and employ a strategy that was almost a 180 from where the company had been.
Interesting. Well, I definitely want to get to that supply chain 180. Before we do that, you hit on a couple of really astounding facts of a loss of 50% of the share. So coming into a situation like that, I would think that figuring out exactly how to get this company to pay attention to what's happening had to be a real challenge, because I'm sure many consumers out there, not unlike myself, still when you go to the pantry and you look and you see a thing of raisins, I see it and then I still look for the red box because I'd rather eat the Sun-Maid red box raisins than whatever that other brand might be.
Well, we appreciate that, and you can tell your friends to keep doing that too. But to your point, SunMaid, from a share position, continues to be dominant within the dried fruit category. And however, there was, and that's despite, like I said, the lack of kind of nurturing and supporting the business over time. It was the first brand to really garner a commanding share, going way back post World Wars. And has been able to hold on to that because of that iconic red box and our iconic Sun-Maid girl. And the raisin industry itself hasn't necessarily created anything to compete effectively against the Sun-Maid business. So it's been there despite the fact that you've got a dried fruit category at retail that's been flat to declining arguably over 10 years. When I talk about the 50% loss in global market share, that's a recognition of the fact that the U.S. industry as a whole, which Sun-Maid is a dominant player in, about a third of the crop or volume of the U.S. industry goes to the retail sector here domestically and some abroad. Another third of it goes to the big domestic cereal and bakery companies. Think about Raisin Bran type cereals, things like that. And then lastly, the other third, and I'm just using round numbers for sake of conversation, but they're directionally correct, is all done on an export basis to other markets around the world. Same aspect though in terms of industrial use. And what the industry wasn't realizing, and why the supply chain side of it becomes more and more important as we get further into the conversation, is that the rest of the world was catching up to the California supply base. So they were able to grow and process raisin products at a greatly reduced cost structure to the US, as you can find in many other markets across the world, and start challenging the US in terms of the ability to provide certification in food safety and global food safety certification, et cetera. So they were able to start competing within those critical industrial markets, which led to a significant decline in US market share.
All right. Well, that's a fascinating story, and I can see exactly what you're talking about is that global supply chain that's not Sun-Maid product or from California has scaled itself into being able to compete on a quality basis and an assurance basis has changed that game. Is there anything that, be it either the supply chain itself or the people, what hit you early on beyond this whole brand experience piece with the retail consumer that jumped out and said, these are the changes I need to pay attention to?
Yeah, I think what jumped out for me was the fact that you did have this great brand, and the question is where was the equity in the brand, and could the equity be used to connect with today's group of consumers, particularly today's millennial parents, which have the majority of spending power in today's market. And the challenge had been is that our organization, because it hadn't really been doing that in terms of evolving and understanding how to market the product, the challenge had been the capability just wasn't here internally from a marketing standpoint. And if you think about that, when we're looking at today's healthy snacking world, which is where dried fruits would be considered, and that we compete against a plethora of other products that you see today, whether it's the bar category, granola bars, things like that. Obviously, the produce and fresh sections of the store continue to grow around the perimeter, and dried fruit being one that, particularly in our case, where the only difference between a bunch of green grapes and a box of Sun-Maid raisins is the fact that ours has been dried in the sun naturally. However, sugar is something from a health and wellness perspective that has been quite challenging here in today's world. And if you think about the dried fruit category, just even 10 years ago, if you were going down the aisle and you were buying products like, say, mango or pineapple, other things like that, a lot of times they were actually covered in sugar. And they were sugar coated. And so sugar being the enemy in today's health and wellness perspectives, there was an incorrect assumption and perception that raisins contained such a high degree of sugar and were coated in sugar that made them unattractive. And so we've had to really work hard to make sure that we're developing products that are on trend from a health and wellness standpoint and a messaging standpoint, to be relevant to today's consumers, which have a very different set of values and obviously dietary aspirations. And we hadn't been doing a good job about that. And so develop that capability. My organization, my predecessor had been in the role for 30 years. And that's great from a leadership, tenureship perspective. But oftentimes when you see, as you would know, complacency can root itself in there as well. And what I inherited was an organization that didn't have the capability to be able to respond to what the market was really looking for. So we've had to reorganize and build that skill set from the ground up. And that's led everything from how we think about the consumer to how we actually process and get the products out the door. Right.
Well, and I can imagine that in this sector of the business, it's no easy task attracting the right levels of talent. all the time from a marketing and new product development. It's not like it's some brand new technology that you're dealing with here. I don't know.
Exactly right.
Yeah. So that led to you getting this right talent, but building from within in this reorganization. Did as you ran into some of this complacency perhaps that was in place, what kind of challenges did you encounter with getting the people's mindset in the right place?
Well, I think the biggest one was, with a new CEO coming in after 30 years, you can imagine there was a lot of trepidation amongst the team here about what was going to happen and who would I bring in and what would our ongoing strategy be. And one of the first things we took a look at is that I had understood, based on talking to my senior staff, that there was a high degree of silos functionally across our business. And to really understand that, and the very basic thing we did is, I sat down with several different groups that I asked HR to put together for us. I said, let's talk about the folks. Let me with people who had been here, say 5 or 10 years up to that point, and then let me talk to the folks that have been here over 20 years, because our average tenureship has been about 22 years or so with the company, which again is great because you have a lot of intrinsic knowledge in terms of how the business operated. But
Right.
It could be challenged in terms of what kind of processes that may not be effective anymore, kind of rooted throughout the business. And I sat down with a group, as you can imagine, of folks have been working here under 10 years, and they were much more positive of, hey, these are the things that we need to do, but they weren't sure if we would actually do it because they hadn't seen Sun-Maid commit to actually changing their strategy and trying to market products differently and launch new products. And then I sat with a group that was over 20 years with the company. And mind you, these people all sit within the same office. We've got roughly about 150 administrative employees as part of our workforce here. Right. And this was a group of about 15 people. And there were 5 people in that room that had worked here for over 20 years in the same office that had never sat in a meeting with one another and had never met each other. So that was a very strong, eye-opening experience to really understand the severity of the silos and the lack of the communication that the business had been operating from. So when we think about the processes and the type of talent that we have to bring in, clearly we want those that, in our case, they've worked with launching new products and innovation. They've understood how to glean insights from consumers and think about where consumers are going. But at the same time, they got to come into an organization that hasn't had that capability historically, and we have to work extra hard to ensure that we're bringing those people along that have been here as part of the business, that have that intrinsic experience. And you often run into we thought about that 15 years ago. We've tried that, we've done that, and we had to continuously talk to them in terms of why it is we wanted to pursue some of the paths that maybe they even had tried before. Because the benefit of having such a strong or long tenureship of over 20 years is, there's no shortage of ideas of products people think SunMaid should launch. The question is how do you prioritize those? How do you assess those? How do you then ultimately execute those? And that process in and of itself was something that was not a cross-functional process, non-existent, and certainly not a cross-functional process here at SunMaid. So it was really important for us to spend a lot of time working with the various functions to help them understand what their peers were doing, how they needed to communicate with their peers, where their spoke fit in the wheel of the machine as we executed and commercialized new products. And we essentially, created different ways in which people could communicate with one another. So they really got a glimpse and understanding of where the business was going, which was something that they had not seen before.
Yeah, I think in Harry, as I think the group has probably made the connection, but in some of the work that our team did with your organization, as we moved from taking this great thought process around marketing, branding, and positioning of products, the ability to deliver on that promise into the supply chain, I think that cross-functional aspect becomes even that much more challenging because they oftentimes are people that are even further removed from this sort of company direction you're talking about here, or at least that's been our experience with many other companies. And I think what I've heard from the team was often the case as we moved into that end-to-end supply chain with SunMaid.
Yep, exactly.
So in that, as you look across that supply chain, in today's world, with the increased competition, the increased inspection and certified products that are out there, et cetera, how has SunMaid managed to deliver on those promises with the existing and new products you've introduced?
Well, the new products we've brought to the table are on track in terms of big launch from a back to school perspective in the back half of 2019. And we launched those products with a good amount of marketing support. We continue to enjoy watching them grow month over month and keep working with the retail base to keep programming that as we've got a long way to go to get to the goals that we have. Coming right behind that, one of the key aspects of our strategy has been understanding all the aspects of the SunMaid brand itself and its emotional connection to consumers. And we have then understood that we can take an emotional element of the SunMaid brand, which has been what most consumers remember as the point when somebody actually gave them the red box and who that person was, not necessarily the red box itself, which was a really exciting insight for us to uncover. And we are using that insight to elevate the SunMaid brand outside of the dried fruit category and launching products in other parts of the grocery store. And when we start thinking about that, a lot of those products, these are not classic dried fruit products. And you, again, take a step back and look at the capabilities of the organization. You think about a great company such as ours, but our company has enjoyed continuity of supply with a strong grower base, strong financial performance, but from a manufacturing and capability perspective, it was a fruit processing plant, meaning that we spec'd the fruit out with our growers. We brought that fruit in, we sourced it, we create different manufacturing specifications to meet the needs of our bulk and industrial customers, and then obviously what our consumer customers would be. And we're washing it and we're packing it. But at the end of that, what you didn't hear in there is we're not making anything. And the challenge for our team has been, okay, if you're starting to develop these products, now we need to adhere to a different type of stringency from a manufacturing and process specification. You need to have research and development involved in what formulation looks like and how you spec even all the materials that go into the formulation. And in our case, because I just mentioned what our capabilities were, when we start looking at adjacent categories where we can elevate our brand, that means that we have to start looking for external manufacturing partners, which is something that SunMaid as a business had never broached before. And so there's just a tremendous amount of learning curve and new experiences for our team as they understand how to bring these products to bear. And when you go onto the classic core business and you think about, to your question on the end-to-end supply chain side of it, even when we look at our classic red box business, we look at our processes of how we're washing and sorting and packing our product to our key specifications. Some of the questions that we had to begin asking ourselves was, okay, well, what's the complexity of how many items we're actually doing this for across the world, because we're sold in over 50 countries internationally. What type of materials are we using? Are we over-specced? Meaning that are we essentially investing too much in certain aspects when we could probably afford to strengthen our efficiencies and use different materials at a better cost structure for us. And a lot of that involved understanding the technical aspects of all of the materials that we have on site, but it also involved the ability and capability where we started working with Maine Pointe was to reach out to suppliers that we were not necessarily working with as part of our history. Because again, you get into that complacency as a business for such a long time, you're not necessarily looking out and looking for new partners. And that's what we found here at SunMaid, is that we needed to open the team's eyes up to, there's a lot of other partners out there, or a lot of folks within the vendor community that would very much like the opportunity to work with a business with the size and scale that SunMaid has. And so we undertook that with your team.
Well, and that's no easy task in terms of you have a co-op of a farming community that know each other and have worked with many of those suppliers for a long time. And now you've got all the product development and marketing people also influencing those decision-making processes. That cross-functional team aspect becomes a really key element to driving value out of that end-to-end supply chain. When you look at continuing to drive value, Harry, as just a way to kind of wrap some of this together, when you think about that value, and I know you're not a publicly held company, but if what you can communicate about creation of value, I'm sure the audience would greatly appreciate not only to date, since you arrived 2.5 years ago, but as you see going forward into the future.
Well, from a numbers perspective, I could say that over the past 12 months or so, on the size of our scale, which is just shy of $500 million or so, for us within the Maine Pointe project, I mean, we were able to get line of sight, and we're in the midst of still executing our projects, but being able to improve our EBITDA numbers by over $10 million, which is no small feat. And the team, understanding that, really had to ask themselves a lot of questions in terms of technical competency, technical capability, and a lot of that is rooted in a continuous improvement mindset. And in order to keep moving that forward, what we've been doing is, with the help of the Maine Pointe organization, was setting up those, in some instances many would consider fundamental processes, but processes in terms of how we work with our vendor community, our supplier community, how we scorecard them and give them good feedback, because we were hearing in many cases when we started this process that we were not necessarily giving a feedback to our vendors in terms of how well they were doing or what SunMaid's needs were as we continued to evolve the business, and then getting into essentially reverse engineering or thinking about market-based approach in terms of a should cost model based on a variety of inputs that we see for our final goods that we're purchasing out of the vendor community. So how are our teams really keeping a finger on the pulse in terms of where certain particularly packaging items, as an example, should be costing us as we move forward, and how do we start developing the discipline where there are routine reviews of that type of information and routine and building routine opportunities for dialogue between ourselves and our vendors to ensure that we're getting the optimum cost as we continue to go forward. And in order to do that, we've, just as we did on more of the commercial side of our business, on the operating side of the business, we've gone through some talent acquisitions to bring some people in, and we've reorganized our teams in a different manner so that they're clearly aligned against those objectives and understand the deliverables they've got to put in place.
Well, Harry, that is really a rather amazing transformation that you're describing here, from the marketing, the branding, the new product development through the entire supply chain, and for that matter, even how specific you have to be in today's world about the manufacturing to provide those products to the marketplace. I can't thank you enough for sharing this enlightening discussion about, from your leadership perspective and the vision you've created for SunMaid to transform itself into a highly competitive consumer brand in today's marketplace. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share with the group from all of this, but I'm sure the audience has really appreciated what you've said to this point. So if you had any further thoughts, please share, and then we'll wrap things up.
No, sounds great. Thanks for the opportunity to share our story. It is one that I know that a lot of leadership teams go into different businesses and they try to create value, and particularly in today's world when you're fighting against a lot of small startups. And I think it's easy to overlook the equity and the opportunity that certain legacy businesses have. But the critical part about that is, one, understanding, what could that strategy and that vision look like, but two, and what we've mostly talked about here today, is just how you execute that with the resources and the teams that you have, and how do you build those capabilities in a manner in which your team now understands where you're going, and your team owns that vision just as much as your leadership team does. And that's what's most exciting for us here at SunMaid.
Well, it's truly exciting. Harry Overly, I can't thank you enough for sharing with our listeners today this whole transformational journey. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you again, Harry. Take care, everyone.
If you'd like more content on supply chain management,
The transformation of the supply chain that's occurring electronically in various aspects, in various ways, seems to be both helping people be more close to the customer in those, like you said, few day or 1 week cycles.
There's a lot of neat gadgets out there, but the best of the best are finding out how to use this technology, both the physical side and the analytical data side, to drive value.
if you haven't already, check out episode 44, where Steve Bowen sits down with Michael Burnett from the University of Tennessee's Global Supply Chain Institute to discuss the impact of digital transformation and company culture on sales and operations planning. That's all we have for today. As always, thank you for listening.
This has been Inside Forbes Councils. Please be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're a member of the Forbes Councils and would like to participate in our podcast series, please email your member concierge. If you're interested in joining a Forbes Council, learn more at ForbesCouncils.com.